So BenQ recently launched their new set of esports gaming monitors, and I've been using this as my main display over the last couple weeks. They've released both the 240Hz model of this monitor, which is the one that I've been personally testing, as well as the 540Hz model, and after using these for just a little bit of time, I can definitely say my mind has actually changed, considering that a high refresh rate is all that matters when it comes to competitive gaming. And a huge thanks to BenQ for sending this monitor out my way. This isn't sponsored or anything, and they don't get to review the video, so this is everything that I'm thinking, but even still, I do want to give them a huge thanks. Now personally, I've used a lot of gaming monitors, from 60Hz to 360, from IPS to OLED, but I don't think I've ever tried a fast TN panel until now. And the special thing about these Zowie displays is they've been the go-to gaming monitor for competitive esports for quite some time. And as reliable as it could be, a trusty Google search shows me that about 3 of every 4 professional gamers use a Zowie display. Now personally, as somebody who's peaked top 500 in competitive Overwatch, the question for me is this monitor actually good, and is there really a difference compared to other monitors? So what about this monitor makes it so special, and why is the go-to for pros? Well, to my understanding, it comes down to 2 things that Zowie's wizardry has created, both being the DIAC technology that's in the panel itself, and that it's a fast TN panel is what they call it. And I'm going to touch on DIAC shortly because I've actually never heard of it up until now, and it is pretty interesting. Comparatively though, other panels like IPS or OLED don't provide as much clarity when it comes down to competitive games. And when it does come down to those esports where tens or even hundreds of thousands of winnings are on the line, every single advantage a player can get makes all the difference. In this case, this esports Zowie monitor is a 24.5-inch 1080p TN panel at 240Hz with a 1 millisecond response time. And that doesn't sound too out of the ordinary when it comes down to a high refresh 1080p display, but what makes it so special is that DIAC 2 technology that they've recently upgraded. To dive a bit further into that DIAC as well as the display itself though, TN panels are known to have poor viewing angles and color accuracy. The thing is, for most professional players, a monitor like this is legitimately a tool, quite actually just meant for the best competitive gaming. And off the bat, while you could definitely use this monitor for other things, this really is meant to be the top option for competitive FPS games. But talking about that DIAC 2, what the hell does that even mean? In short, where a typical panel has a continuous backlight to light up the pixels, DIAC 2 pretty much turns the backlight off and on between perceivable frames, which reduces motion blur you might find on, say, an IPS panel, and it increases the clarity while gaming. And from a motion standpoint, this legitimately and physically reduces motion blur and ghosting on the display itself due to the backlights physically being turned on and off. So with all of this in mind and those technologies between DIAC and the TN panel, does this really make a difference? Honestly and surprisingly, yes. Hopping into my main competitive game, Overwatch 2, I really don't know if it's a placebo or the actual display just being that much better, but I was surprisingly actually able to hit more shots than I typically would. And it's hard for me to show you through a YouTube video as well, but since this is my first time on a TN panel with DIAC, I'm actually surprised to see this perform as well as it has. And I actually was curious enough to know if this really was placebo, so I decided to sub out this monitor with my 360Hz Pixio Prime S, which is a 1080p IPS display with a faster refresh rate. The Pixio was the closest thing I had to compare, so this is what I found. Pushing the same image to both displays, the 240Hz Zowie consistently had a clear image even with a lower refresh rate. And don't get me wrong, I'm far from a legitimate professional when it comes down to gaming, but I was surprised to see these differences. It's sort of one of those things you actually have to play with on the display itself to really get a feel for it. For giggles though, I did toss in my 240Hz OLED to showcase the difference between IPS, TN, and OLED, and here's the difference for these. Still, even just swapping around the DIAC 2 settings on the Zowie display, there actually is quite a noticeable difference here as well. The crazy thing too, like I mentioned, is that TN panels are supposed to look pretty bad in general, and I was pleased to see that isn't quite the case here with this display. It's definitely not going to compare to like an OLED or some of the IPS displays out there, but it does still hold up pretty well. And coming down to the competitive aspect and clarity of a TN panel, it definitely shines in that category. And I can't say that I would personally use this display every single day for my non-competitive gaming, but for the times where I just don't want to swap on my monitor, it's still going to hold up just fine. I think for myself, the dream would be this panel in 1440p with DIAC 2 at a high refresh rate. And while I am an Overwatch 1 trick, I did go ahead and download Zowie's Overwatch 2 profile preset, which configured my entire display to be what should be the best display settings when it comes down to competitive gaming. Still, if you do play multiple games competitively, there is this included S switch where you can actually swap between 3 profiles. For myself, I'm only using 2 of these, one for Overwatch and one for just like my generic PlayStation 5 profile, since I don't really swap around all that much. So yeah, it's definitely a nice touch. Not that you can't just change it manually, but this makes that a little bit easier. And if you do have some sort of secret sauce profile, you can export that and share these with other people, which is pretty badass. So yeah, not bad considering the alternative would be swapping things around manually every time you want to change games. And like I mentioned, I won't pretend like you wouldn't probably use a different monitor for your adventure or RPG games and stuff, but I did try this with my PlayStation 5 and it worked as expected. If you are going to be doing some sort of competitive gaming on your console, for example, you're still going to be getting full diac compatibility as long as you're gaming over 100 Hz. In this case, while I'm still absolutely trash at Call of Duty, playing on my PlayStation 5 at 120 Hz is still pretty badass, and clarity-wise, it's still going to be improved compared to other 120 Hz displays. From a competitive standpoint, it's still definitely earning that check mark for console gaming. You won't be getting HDR or VRR and those sort of perks, but it does hold up just fine for competitive console gaming. Now, when it comes down to the stand on this monitor, that's definitely something I want to touch on because it's quite literally the best stand I've ever used on any monitor ever. The tilt and height adjustments on here are actually simply nuts. Plus, any sort of resetting up you ever need to do while traveling is a legitimate non-issue, considering these notches and measurable instruments on the monitor itself to make sure you always have the exact setup wherever you go. There's also base rotation if you do need it, a handle to carry the monitor itself, as well as a headphone holder on the back end of the display. It's all of these small touches combined that really cater to the esports competitor. And from an input standpoint, there is a port for the S switch, a display port, 3 HDMI 2.0s, and one thing I can definitely appreciate on here is that there actually is a headphone jack, which is definitely useful for my speakers whenever I'm not gaming competitively. One thing I can say from a design standpoint is that the bezels are absolutely massive, not that that really affects the performance of this monitor in any way, shape, or form. But with everything I've talked about when it comes down to this monitor, is it really that much better when it comes to competitive gaming? Surprisingly and honestly, yeah, like I mentioned, I just wasn't expecting it. For myself going in, I really thought it was going to be a letdown because I've used all these high refresh displays and I didn't think this would have a tangible benefit to competitive gaming. Not that I actually play in esports tournaments or anything like that, but if I really do want to push my rank, if I want to sit down and legitimately try to push rank, I'm going to be using this monitor. When it comes down to those FPS games, it's really hard not to see the advantage of a monitor like this. Sure, it's not good at everything else, but between the almost non-existent motion blur and clarity across the entire experience, there's definitely a competitive advantage to be had here. I'm not much of a Counter-Strike 2 player myself, but there's even that massive CS2 tourney coming up like next week, and if I'm not mistaken, all the players will be using the predecessor, which is the 360 Hz Diac Plus version. Now sure, I would have loved to try the 540 Hz model, but for myself, I have the 240, and it's done an incredible job, and like I mentioned, going forward, it will be my go-to competitive monitor. But yeah, pleasantly surprised. I wasn't expecting that, but I'd love to hear what you guys think down below in the comment section. I appreciate you watching till the end. Till next time.